Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the agricultural fields surrounding Cody, Wyoming. When you think of grizzly bear attacks, a cornfield isn't the first background that comes to mind. But this area isn't just farm fields. The Shoshone National Forest surrounds it and is only about 30 miles east of Yellowstone National Park. The land between the park and the farmland is remote and rugged mountains with uninterrupted forests of pine, fir, and spruce trees along the ridges. The Shoshone National Forest is on the eastern slope of the Great Divide, and all the waters that fill the creeks head toward the Mississippi River. Down in the valleys, willows and berry bushes screen the creek banks for the animals that live there. Moose, mule deer, elk, and antelope are common sights here. Black bears, bobcats, cougars, grizzly bears, and wolves stalk the trails while they raise the next generation of predators. Although the ridges and hillsides may be as wild as they've ever been, the agricultural areas in the valleys are dotted with ranches and farms. The water that feeds the creeks and streams is often diverted to water the corn, wheat, and alfalfa that grows here. It may be too remote for most people, but the hardy people of western Wyoming wouldn't live anywhere else. This lifestyle demands hard work, which shapes and conditions the people who work the land. On Thursday, June 20th, 2013, 65-year-old Nick Patrick had beaten the sun out of bed and was headed toward his fields. The creek beds around Nick's fields were crowded with brush and smaller trees that hid pheasants, grouse, and deer. They were all common sights in the early morning hours and were always a pleasant surprise for Nick. Nick was a big supporter of the protection of grizzly bears in Wyoming. He served on the Greater Yellowstone Coalition Board, which strives to preserve vital habitats, create travel corridors for wildlife, and connect human allies to support these resources. Nick had even hosted board meetings at his ranch in recent years. This week, Nick had a handful of special visitors to his ranch. His oldest daughter had brought her 4 children to visit Grandpa on the ranch, but Nick didn't let that pull him away from his work. He would complete the day's work, then visit with them afterward, catching up on all the fun events that had transpired in their lives. As Nick worked his way along the ditch bank, his dog began to bark incessantly a short distance away. Raccoons were common in the area, and Nick assumed the dog had run into another one. He picked up his shovel and headed toward the gully, located about 50 yards from where he was working in the field. Just as Nick began to walk down into the gully, he could see his dog. It was barking toward the brush along the creek, but what he was barking at wasn't very clear. Before Nick could gain control of the dog, a huge sow grizzly stormed from the brush, followed closely by her 2 cubs. Grizzly bears are not an uncommon sight around Cody, especially on the hills above Nick's fields. They can be seen grazing their way across green meadows from the roads in springtime. Once in a while, a problem will arise with a bear killing livestock or raiding grain supplies, but generally they keep to themselves. They tend to avoid anything affiliated with humans as much as possible. Once the sow set her eyes on Nick, there wasn't much taking her attention away from him. She quickly covered the ground between them at a rate that didn't afford Nick any time to think, let alone react. He could see her massive shoulder muscles ripple with each stride as she streaked toward him. It was clear by her immense size that Nick could not fight her, and he knew good and well there was no sense in trying to outrun her. Nick had only one weapon at his side, his trusty shovel. He picked it up like a baseball bat and did his best impression of Babe Ruth upside the grizzly's head. As the shovel smacked against the sow's skull, Nick soon realized the noise it made was the worst part. The grizzly wasn't bothered by the blow from the shovel and didn't slow down in her progress toward him. Given he had put all of his energy into swinging the shovel, Nick was briefly left in a twisted posture. Both of his arms were holding the shovel, which was now to his left and behind him. This pose left his face pointed toward the bear, with nothing to protect it. The angry sow used the awkward position Nick's shovel swing left him in, and clamped her jaws around his entire face. Her canines sank in from cheekbone to cheekbone, and when she closed her jaws, she peeled off the skin between them, including Nick's nose. The cracking and popping of his cheekbones drowned out all the other noise Nick could hear. The sow pulled the mouthful of Nick's face away, while pressing his shoulders with her paws. As the sow loosened her grip on Nick's face, she slid her jaws down his body to his left knee. Clamping her jaws onto it, she dragged him about 20 feet, puncturing and tearing flesh as she did so. Now missing most of the middle part of his face and fearing the sow was going to continue her attack, Nick flipped onto his stomach. Playing dead must have seemed like the best option, as resistance was clearly futile. He was hoping that he could cover up any vulnerable parts of himself that she hadn't yet bit into, but for some reason the sow suddenly changed her mind. It may have been thoughts of her cubs, or perhaps she felt Nick was no longer a danger. Either way, the sow disappeared into the brush as Nick lay on his stomach. As he lifted his head from the soil, Nick could feel his upper lip flopping against his chin. He knew this grizzly had done some terrifying damage to his face, so he reached into his pocket in search of his cell phone. He pulled the phone out and quickly dialed 911, hoping to find a calming professional on the other end. Unfortunately for Nick, the gully he was in was without reception, and no one answered his call for help. Upon seeing him moving, the grizzly sow bounded back in Nick's direction. She must have figured he was dead when she left, and was a bit angered to see he wasn't. This time she bit onto the back of his head and chewed up his scalp real good. Like the unwilling participant in some kind of sadistic game, Nick jerked and screamed each time the sow bit into a different area than she had previously. The pressure from her jaws was the most overwhelming sensation. Nick had never felt such pain before in his life, and felt the bear's canines piercing his flesh and slamming against his bones, with crunches that resonated through his body. Her claws and teeth punched quick holes and gashes through Nick's vest and back before she dashed back into the brush. As soon as she left him, Nick peeked up the gully to see her gather her cubs and leave. He continued to watch the bears as they disappeared from sight, hoping that she would not return for a third round. Nick pulled himself together and began assessing his wounds, at least those that he could see. His most devastating injury was clearly out of his view, but he could feel the middle part of his face was missing. It may have been the adrenaline, but Nick knew he had to get to medical help as quickly as possible. There was no one walking along that gully any time soon, in all likelihood, and Nick couldn't afford to wait for help. He slowly worked his way to his feet and staggered toward his home, which was a few hundred yards away. After reaching his home, he stumbled his way back to his shop. Nick knew his grandkids would run outside to see him as soon as he arrived, and he knew that the damage the sow had inflicted on his face would terrify them. He immediately stumbled into his workshop in search of a towel, trailing blood behind him. Wiping the blood and other bodily fluids from his face, Nick eventually found the towel he was looking for and draped it over his head. Then he staggered toward the house to ask them to call for medical help. When first responders arrived, they loaded Nick into the ambulance and rushed him toward West Park Hospital in Cody. As soon as he arrived, the medical staff there recognized that his wounds were far too severe for treatment from their facility. They arranged for a medical helicopter to transport Nick to the University of Colorado Hospital in Aurora, Colorado. He was stabilized there and remained in the intensive care unit while a ventilator helped him breathe. The middle of Nick's face, including his nose and all the skin between his cheekbones, had completely been removed. The risk of infection was immediately identified, given the injuries to his sinuses only a few inches from his brain. Wyoming Game and Fish officers began an investigation into the cause and circumstances of Nick's grizzly bear attack. They set out culvert traps along the gullies and fields in the area, hoping to catch the bears before any further incidents could occur. If they caught the sow, they could check her for a lip tattoo or an ear tag to gauge whether she had been a problem bear or if this was simply an isolated incident. They were not considering euthanizing the sow without knowing her background, if there was one at all. The wardens found the sow's tracks and followed them away from the agricultural areas in the valley. The bears had departed for more remote areas away from people. Given she would not likely encounter any more people in the location she had ended up at, they decided to stop tracking her, for now. Wardens decided the grizzly sow had reacted to a perceived threat to herself and her cubs. As severe as it was, the attack was deemed a defensive attack. Nick's dog ended up with a long gash down his back, but recovered from his run-in with the grizzly. Nick's efforts had likely saved his dog's life, but nearly cost him his own. As Nick slowly recovered in the ICU, his friends sent prayers and messages of support. They noted that being in good physical condition probably contributed to him surviving the severe mauling. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Would the sow have left after the initial attack if he had played dead? Did the presence of the dog add an aggravating circumstance for the grizzly? Do you think this sow should be pursued and killed after such a brutal mauling? I will gladly read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. Will help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.